April 21, 1945, forest near Duisburg and Lindhof, Germany. Field Marshal Walter Maude found himself alone in a quiet clearing, his service pistol heavy in his grip. Behind him lay the shattered remnants of Army Group B, over 300,000 men who, over the preceding days, had laid down their arms to the advancing American forces. Ahead of him, however, there was a decision that offered no real choice. Surrender was unthinkable. To face capture by the Soviets was intolerable. That afternoon, the single gunshot that echoed through the trees did more than end one life. It marked the endpoint of a larger, perplexing pattern in the final days of the war, a phenomenon that would confound military historians for decades. Between March and May of 1945, nearly 3 million German soldiers chose to surrender to Western Allied forces rather than continue the fight. In many cases, these men traversed miles of their own defensive lines, unarmed, emerging from fortified positions with makeshift white flags fashioned from sheets or tablecloths. They did not surrender because they were out of ammunition, because their defenses had crumbled, or even because Germany's defeat was absolute. Their capitulation was deliberate, motivated above all by the desire to evade capture by the Soviet Red Army. The scale of surrender was staggering. From the Normandy landings on June 6, 1944, to Adolf Hitler's death on April 30, 1945, over 2.8 million German soldiers gave themselves up to Western forces on the northwestern European front. Of this total, roughly 1.5 million surrendered during April 1945 alone. During the first half of the month, about 39,000 soldiers were surrendering each day. By the last 16 days, that number had surged to nearly 59,000 daily. These soldiers still possessed weapons, ammunition, and defensible positions. Yet they chose to relinquish all of it while the Nazi leadership persisted, military law demanded resistance, and Hitler himself remained alive in Berlin. What they lacked was the resolve to confront the eastward advance of the Red Army, whose approach was relentless and marked by vengeance. To grasp why so many German troops willingly laid down their arms, one must consider what they knew about the alternative. Reports of atrocities, suffering, and near-certain death in Soviet captivity were widespread. Soldiers returning from the Eastern Front, letters that survived censorship, and rumors circulating in the army provided first-hand accounts. These were not exaggerated propaganda. These were testimonies of soldiers who had endured the consequences of falling into Soviet hands. They remembered Stalingrad. Of the 91,000 men of the 6th Army who surrendered there in February 1943, only about 6,000 survived to return home. The rest perished over the months following surrender, victims of hunger, disease, exposure, and forced labor. They were aware of the brutal marches deeper into Soviet territory, where captives were driven hundreds of miles with minimal food or rest, and those who lagged were executed. They knew of the labor camps across Siberia, the harsh battalions in the Urals, and the severe conditions that claimed over 1 million German prisoners before 1956. Post-war investigations confirmed these dangers quantitatively. The West German Maschke Commission reported that of 360,000 German soldiers captured by the Soviets, 194,250 died in captivity, a mortality rate of more than 1 in 3, even after hostilities had ceased. For a soldier in 1945, these figures were terrifyingly tangible. Survival in the East was uncertain at best, often impossible. The fear compelling German troops westward, however, went beyond statistics. It stemmed from the awareness of Germany's own brutal actions in the Soviet Union. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, the Wehrmacht waged a campaign they referred to as a Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation. Nazi ideology deemed Slavic peoples subhuman, fit only for subjugation or extermination. Plans had been drawn to starve 30 million Soviet civilians to secure Lebensraum for German settlers. In practice, the Wehrmacht deliberately allowed 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war to die from starvation out of the 5.7 million captured, a death rate exceeding 50%. By the spring of 1945, German soldiers on the Western Front had internalized a simple, grim equation: surrender to the Americans or British offered the possibility of life, surrender to the Soviets almost guaranteed death. These realities, more than any shortage of supplies or collapse of morale, dictated the unprecedented mass capitulation that reshaped the final weeks of the war in Europe. In stark contrast to the fate of Soviet prisoners, only a small fraction, about 3.5% of British and American soldiers captured by German forces died while in captivity. On the Eastern Front, however, German units had been directly involved in systematic atrocities, including the Holocaust, where 2 million of the 6 million Jewish victims were murdered on Soviet soil. Villages were incinerated, civilians and partisans were executed indiscriminately, and entire communities were punished collectively for suspected resistance. By the end of the war, the deaths of some 26 million Soviet soldiers and civilians had been inflicted by German hands. This reality was universally known among German troops by 1945. Each soldier, whether directly involved in killings or not, understood that the advancing Red Army was not just an enemy force, it was a vessel of retribution for crimes of staggering magnitude. This awareness created a profound contrast when German soldiers faced American forces. From the outset, their encounters shattered decades of Nazi propaganda which had portrayed Western allies as brutal and merciless. Under orders from Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, American troops strictly adhered to the laws of war. Prisoners were provided with medical attention, sufficient food, and humane treatment. Torture, summary execution, and forced labor outside the framework of the Geneva Conventions were systematically avoided. News of this treatment spread rapidly across German lines, often faster than any formal military dispatch could. In some cases, surrendered German soldiers were held in temporary camps within sight of ongoing German defensive positions. Their comrades could observe them alive, largely unharmed, receiving both nourishment and care. This visual evidence often carried far more weight than propaganda or rumor. When the Ruhr pocket collapsed between April 14 and 18, 1945, around 317,000 German troops faced a stark decision. Surrounded, low on supplies, and with the option to attempt a perilous breakout to the east or to surrender to the Americans in the west, most chose the latter. Field Marshal Model had dissolved Army Group B rather than issuing formal surrender orders, effectively allowing soldiers to select their own fate. Their choice, while rooted in self-preservation, also reflected an understanding of broader national interests. By May 1945, many Germans had grasped that the future of their country depended on the willingness of Western allies, especially the Americans, to enable reconstruction rather than impose a harsh occupation akin to the Soviet model. The massive wave of surrenders in the spring of 1945 was not spontaneous but the result of months of strategic calculation. Following the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, Allied forces from the United States, Britain, and Canada steadily secured Normandy. France was liberated by September, and despite the temporary setback during the Battle of the Bulge, Allied armies reached Germany's western frontier by December. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Red Army, energized by its victory at Stalingrad, advanced relentlessly westward. Operation Bagration, launched on June 22, 1944, the third anniversary of Barbarossa, decimated the German Army Group Center, inflicting 400,000 to 450,000 casualties within 9 weeks, marking the largest single military defeat Germany had ever suffered. By January 1945, Soviet forces had penetrated East Prussia and were less than 100 miles from Berlin. The German military found itself caught between two overwhelming forces. Its manpower was depleted, industrial output severely damaged by relentless strategic bombing, and fuel supplies nearly exhausted. Beyond these logistical pressures, German soldiers confronted a critical reality. The two advancing Allied armies represented radically different outcomes for those captured. The leadership of Germany in early 1945 was acutely aware of this distinction and took steps, however limited, to exploit it. The decisions of that final phase of the war, surrenders to the Americans rather than attempts to reach the Soviets, reflected both tactical pragmatism and a calculated hope that Germany might survive under Western rather than Soviet administration. After Adolf Hitler's suicide on April 30, 1945, Admiral Karl Dönitz assumed leadership of Germany and pursued a strategy that historians have later described as staggered partial surrenders in the Western theater. Documents captured by the Allies, now preserved in the U.S. National Archives, reveal that Dönitz's objective was to gain time to transfer as many German units from the Eastern Front to the West as possible. His aim was to surrender these forces intact to British and American hands while preventing their capture by the Soviets or Yugoslav forces. The process began with Italy's capitulation on April 29, 1945. Dönitz attempted to negotiate localized surrenders to Western allies, all the while hoping to continue resisting the Soviet advance. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery accepted the surrender of German troops in the Netherlands, Northwest Germany, and Denmark on May 4. 2 days later, General Alfred Jodl arrived at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force (SEF) in Reims, offering to capitulate all forces fighting the Western Allies, yet maintain opposition against the Soviets. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's response decisively blocked this approach. He made it clear that German forces would be denied access to Western surrender lines, effectively leaving them no choice but to yield to the Soviets unless Germany agreed to unconditional surrender across all fronts simultaneously. Confronted with this ultimatum, Jodl signed the unconditional surrender at 2:41 a.m. on May 7, 1945 in Reims, effectively ending the war in Europe. The Soviet Union, distrustful of having been excluded from a separate agreement, demanded a second ceremony in Berlin on May 8, with Soviet representatives present, which they regarded as the definitive legal act of surrender. The Battle of Holbay provides a stark example of German forces' desperation to avoid falling into Soviet hands. From April 24 to May 1, 1945, the remnants of the German Ninth Army, roughly 200,000 soldiers, accompanied by tens of thousands of civilian refugees, were encircled by Soviet troops in a shrinking pocket southeast of Berlin. General Theodore Bussy, commanding these forces, ordered a westward breakout toward American positions near the Elbe River, fully aware that capture by the Soviets would likely be fatal. The ensuing struggle was catastrophic. Soviet artillery, armored units, and infantry relentlessly attacked the pocket. German troops fought not for strategic gains but purely to escape encirclement and reach American lines. Approximately 30,000 soldiers succeeded in reaching U.S. positions, constituting roughly one-third of those trapped. Overall casualties, including civilians, are estimated between 24,000 and 60,000. By contrast, on the Western Front, German troops frequently abandoned the opportunity for protracted resistance even when conditions were far more favorable. The surrender of the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945 provides a clear illustration. American forces completed their encirclement of this region on April 1, and by April 18, organized German resistance had ceased. Despite holding significant defensive advantages, densely populated terrain, urban structures, factories, and other infrastructure conducive to a strong defense, German forces opted not to engage in sustained urban combat. Army Group B, comprising 370,000 men across 19 divisions with ample ammunition and prepared positions, could have mounted a Stalingrad-style defense that would have inflicted severe casualties on attacking American forces. Instead, beginning on April 14, mass surrenders commenced following the collapse of command within Army Group B. Entire divisions walked into American custody without firing a shot. Among them, the 116th Panzer Division, a battle-hardened formation that had fought from Normandy through the Ardennes, surrendered despite having no serviceable tanks or artillery. The soldiers remained physically capable and could have resisted, yet they deliberately chose to capitulate. Overall, American casualties in subduing the Ruhr Pocket were roughly 10,000, while 317,000 German troops surrendered, a ratio indicating that most German units relinquished combat voluntarily. This behavior was emblematic of a broader trend across Western Germany during the final weeks of the war. As Allied forces advanced, they encountered what General Dwight D. Eisenhower described as a demoralized or whipped army. Cities and towns often surrendered without meaningful resistance, raising white flags or offering token opposition. Retreating German units frequently surrendered at subsequent points, making actual combat comparatively rare. The pace of captures reflects this dynamic starkly. In March 1945, American and British forces averaged 10,000 German prisoners per day. By early April, daily captures surged to around 39,000, and by the latter half of April, the number peaked at roughly 59,000 per day. Many of these prisoners were not the result of battlefield defeats or encirclements, but were largely voluntary surrenders. Entire formations, having abandoned defensive positions, walked into Allied custody. This choice represented a strategic calculation. German soldiers recognized the inevitability of defeat. Resisting the Americans might delay the outcome for a short period, but would ultimately exhaust their forces, leaving them vulnerable to the advancing Soviets from the east. Attempting to retreat eastward only postponed capture, as they would eventually encounter the Soviet army. In this context, surrender became the rational option for preserving life, even at the cost of captivity. For many Germans in the final months of World War II, the Americans represented the only realistic hope for survival and the possibility of rebuilding their country afterward. By the spring of 1945, a growing number of Germans had come to realize that the future of their nation depended on the willingness of the Western Allies to permit reconstruction. In practical terms, German soldiers who surrendered to American forces were making a deliberate choice about which version of post-war Germany they wanted to live in. Understanding why German units in the East continued to fight tenaciously even as the Western Front collapsed requires examining the starkly different conditions in the two theaters of war. On the Western Front, surrender to American or British troops often meant survival. Commanders could rationally conclude that by placing their men in Allied custody, they were preserving lives that could contribute to Germany's post-war recovery. By contrast, surrendering to Soviet forces carried almost certain peril. The mortality rate in Soviet captivity was extraordinarily high. Estimates suggest that roughly 1 in 3 German prisoners sent east did not survive. Commanders, many of whom had endured years of grueling combat alongside their soldiers, could not in good conscience expose their men to such a fate without first exhausting all other options. The Eastern Front also carried a broader strategic and humanitarian dimension. Each day that German forces managed to hold off the advancing Red Army offered civilians in occupied territories a better chance to escape westward. In early 1945, massive waves of refugees poured out of eastern Germany, comprised largely of women, children, and the elderly. These people fled by every available means on foot, in overloaded carts, on trains packed beyond capacity, clutching whatever belongings they could carry. For soldiers, their mission in the war's final weeks extended beyond military objectives. They saw themselves as providing a protective corridor for these fleeing civilians. Decisions about surrender in 1945 were shaped by a complex interplay of pragmatic calculation, sense of national duty, personal fear, and awareness of collective responsibility for the war. Most German soldiers were not primarily motivated by moral recognition of their actions, though some expressed such understanding. They were making survival-based judgments under extraordinary pressure. Choosing to surrender to American rather than Soviet forces reflected a calculated decision about which option maximized the chances of living through the war's final phase. These decisions were informed by a clear recognition of the consequences of German actions on the Eastern Front, by observations of how Americans treated prisoners, and by assessments of post-war realities. Even after Germany's unconditional surrender on May 7-8, 1945, fighting did not immediately cease in all regions. Some units sought to reach Western lines before surrender orders took full effect. In Latvia, for instance, the encircled forces of Army Group North remained cut off since October 1944 and did not formally capitulate to the Soviets until May 9. Similarly, German troops in Czechoslovakia continued to clash with advancing Soviet forces while attempting to break through to American-held areas. The Prague Uprising, which began on May 5 when Czech resistance forces attacked German units, quickly escalated into fierce urban combat. German soldiers often responded with brutal force, motivated by the fear that partisans would deliver them to the Soviets. Only once American and Soviet forces met and delineated occupation zones did hostilities in the region truly end. For those who ultimately surrendered to the Americans, the experience of captivity and treatment had a lasting impact. These interactions shaped their post-war memories and attitudes toward the United States for decades to come. The choices made in those final days reflected not abstract morality but reasoned attempts to survive a war that had left much of Europe in ruins and millions of lives in jeopardy. The period immediately following the surrender on the Western Front, while challenging for German prisoners, gradually shifted toward comparatively humane conditions. Prisoners were moved from temporary holding facilities to more permanent camps, and over time most were returned to civilian life. Between 1945 and 1948, the majority of German soldiers held by the Western Allies made their way back home. Upon returning, they found Germany in ruins. Cities had been devastated by extensive bombing campaigns, the economy was on the brink of collapse, and the country was partitioned into zones controlled by the occupying powers. Despite these hardships, these men survived, rebuilt their lives, married, raised families, and reconstructed their local communities. Depending on where they resettled, they became citizens either of the Federal Republic of Germany in the West or the German Democratic Republic in the East. Many adopted democratic values and aligned themselves with the Western political and security frameworks, embracing the principles of the Atlantic Alliance. In stark contrast, German soldiers captured by the Soviet Union faced far harsher circumstances. Roughly 480,000 were taken prisoner during the Battle of Berlin, and over 1 million more were captured during the final stages of the Eastern Front campaign. These prisoners entered a system designed to extract labor to aid post-war reconstruction, rather than prioritize their well-being. The Soviet Union had endured enormous destruction, nearly 26 million deaths, the obliteration of 1,700 cities and towns, and the dismantling of over 32,000 factories. The German invasion had left the nation in economic chaos, and Soviet authorities, while formally observing Geneva Convention rules, were primarily focused on rebuilding their shattered country. German prisoners in Soviet hands were deployed as a labor force across mines, factories, construction projects, and farms. The immediate post-war years of 1945–1946 were particularly brutal, as famine threatened the population and rations were barely sufficient to keep prisoners alive. By 1947, conditions had improved as the Soviet economy stabilized, but the pace of repatriation remained slow. Many German prisoners were not released until between 1947 and 1950, and some remained in captivity until 1956, more than a decade after the war had ended. The consequences of these surrender choices extended well beyond mere survival. The nearly 3 million German soldiers who opted for Western captivity became integral to the formation of post-war West German society. Their exposure to American military organization, logistical efficiency, and adherence to formal rules for treatment of prisoners left a lasting imprint. Coupled with the economic support of the Marshall Plan and the security umbrella provided by the United States against potential Soviet aggression, these experiences helped orient the Federal Republic firmly toward the West and paved the way for its integration into NATO. Many of the men who later assumed leadership roles in post-war Germany had first-hand experience of surrendering to Western forces rather than facing potential Soviet retribution. The question of justice for German soldiers who had participated in Nazi campaigns remains complicated. While the highest-ranking officials, SS personnel, concentration camp staff, and those directly implicated in atrocities were prosecuted, the ordinary Wehrmacht soldier was rarely held accountable. Even those who had served on the Eastern Front or witnessed crimes often returned home without facing legal consequences. This allowed millions of men, many of whom had been involved in aggressive warfare and acts of genocide, to reintegrate into civilian life and become part of post-war society. The treatment of German prisoners in the Soviet Union, in contrast, reflected the USSR's distinct priorities and historical experience. The catastrophic losses and destruction the country had suffered shaped a policy that emphasized reconstruction and labor extraction over individual prisoner welfare. This divergence in handling prisoners of war not only influenced the immediate post-war experiences of millions of Germans, but also had long-term implications for the political, social, and economic orientation of the divided German states. After World War II, Soviet authorities sought to exploit German prisoners of war, POWs, to reconstruct the immense destruction left by the Nazi invasion. In practice, these prisoners endured far harsher conditions than those held by Western forces. They were detained for extended periods, subjected to intense labor, and released gradually over time. The partitioning of Germany into separate occupation zones, eventually solidifying into East and West Germany, meant that the choices German soldiers made about where to surrender in 1945 largely dictated the political and social environment they would re-enter upon release. Those who gave themselves up to Western forces generally returned to what became West Germany, while those captured in the East often ended up in Soviet-controlled territories, later forming East Germany. Viewed retrospectively, the surrender of German forces in 1945 ranks as one of the most extraordinary military disintegrations in history, not necessarily due to the speed of defeat, but because of the selective nature of it. German troops did not abandon the fight uniformly as defeat loomed. Instead, they surrendered to certain adversaries while continuing to resist others, making calculated, rational decisions to maximize their survival. On a massive scale, nearly 3 million German soldiers chose to capitulate to Western forces, effectively casting their lot against continued Nazi resistance and the threat of Soviet captivity. Their decisions reflected a prioritization of life over martial honor, the prospect of a future over loyalty to a collapsing past, and American pragmatism over Soviet retribution. In this light, the ultimate tally of World War II in Europe is shaped not just by battles, but by these profound choices of surrender. Resistance on the Western Front collapsed in ways the Eastern Front never did. German soldiers in the West often survived by surrendering, whereas in the East, capitulation frequently meant death or years in brutal captivity. The disparity is evident in casualty figures. The number of German killed or wounded on the Eastern Front far exceeded the number taken prisoner, while in the West, the reverse was true: prisoners greatly outnumbered combat casualties. This asymmetry imposed a tremendous human cost. Every German soldier killed while facing the Red Army in 1945 might have survived had circumstances allowed surrender to American forces. Conversely, every Soviet soldier who perished against German troops did so while confronting enemies simultaneously surrendering en masse in the West. For American forces, the flood of German prisoners was simultaneously reassuring and sobering. It confirmed the reputation of U.S. troops for disciplined, lawful treatment of captives, yet it also made clear that German soldiers were fleeing the consequences of the Eastern Front more than they were seeking clemency. General Dwight Eisenhower, navigating delicate communications with Soviet commanders, faced the dual task of upholding Allied commitments while managing the sudden, immense influx of prisoners. The long-term effects of these surrender decisions shaped post-war Germany in profound ways. West Germany, largely composed of men who had surrendered to Western armies, developed into a prosperous democratic state and a reliable American ally. East Germany, in contrast, absorbed many former POWs from Soviet captivity and became a communist state under strict Soviet control. Even after reunification in 1990, the psychological and societal echoes of these wartime choices persisted. The Atlantic orientation of modern Germany, its integration into NATO and the European Union, and its partnership with the United States are rooted, in part, in the wartime decisions of millions of soldiers who opted to surrender to Americans rather than face Soviet forces. The difference in survival prospects between East and West was stark and life-altering. Those who surrendered to American forces faced roughly a 1% chance of dying in captivity. By contrast, those who fell into Soviet hands confronted a mortality rate of approximately 1 in 3, along with the risk of permanent disappearance. Given this stark contrast, it is unsurprising that millions of German soldiers moved westward to surrender. However, the roughly 480,000 troops captured by the Soviets during the Battle of Berlin had no alternative. Encircled in the capital with no Western army to turn to, they fought to the bitter end and subsequently endured the fate that their fellow Germans had sought to avoid for months. Ultimately, the massive surrender to Western forces represents a striking example of rational choice under extreme duress. Geography, perceived treatment by the enemy, and the imperative to survive all played decisive roles. The story of Germany's 1945 military collapse is not only about lost battles, it is about calculated human decisions that reshaped nations, lives, and the geopolitical landscape of post-war Europe. In the final stages of the war, many German soldiers opted to surrender rather than continue fighting. Their opponents in the West were not faceless enemies bent on annihilation, but forces that could offer a chance to survive, a path to eventual reintegration into a rebuilding Germany. By relinquishing their arms, these men preserved their lives in a conflict where survival was far from guaranteed. Faced with the stark choice between probable death and possible survival, millions of German troops in the Western theaters made the decision that self-preservation demanded. This reality was largely absent on the Eastern Front. There, surrender often meant almost certain execution or harsh imprisonment under Soviet forces, leaving soldiers no real alternative to fighting to the bitter end. This divergence in the prospect of captivity created a striking contrast in resistance. While the Western Front disintegrated rapidly, the Eastern Front remained fiercely contested. Consequently, American and other Western Allied forces were able to capture close to 3 million German troops, sustaining comparatively minor casualties, whereas the Soviets were compelled to advance inch by inch, city by city, building by building, paying a staggering human cost. The outcome of Allied operations in Europe was shaped not only by strategy, superior firepower, and aerial bombardment, but also by the differing incentives presented to soldiers in captivity. One path offered survival, the other near certain death. German troops, regardless of their ideological convictions, prior actions, or allegiance to the Nazi hierarchy, recognized this distinction clearly. When presented with the opportunity to live, they overwhelmingly chose life. These individual decisions, occurring across millions of soldiers in the spring of 1945, effectively ended organized German resistance in the West. This accelerated the end of the conflict in Europe and set the stage for the post-war political and social landscape, the consequences of which continued to resonate long after the guns fell silent.